Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Bengiovanni. Today I'm going to be taking you through ecosystem interactions, mainly abiotic, and we're going to be focusing on how energy is transferred through an ecosystem. So we're going to start out today by talking about how energy flows through ecosystems. So the first thing to note is that the sun is the main source of energy for all life on Earth, with the exception of some bacteria. Through the process of photosynthesis, autotrophs are able to make their own food. Typical autotrophs would be plants, some algae, and certain types of bacteria. And once the autotrophs make their own food and store the energy from the sun in the bonds of organic molecules, then heterotrophs will eat those organic molecules that the autotrophs made, and they will gain their energy from them. So we're going to start out by taking a look at the process of photosynthesis. For right now, we're just kind of learn the basics of it, and then later in the year, you will learn this process in more detail. But basically what we want you to concentrate on right now is that organisms like plants can use energy from the sun and combine carbon dioxide with water. And through that process and through a pretty complex set of chemical reactions, oxygen gets produced, which is released back into the atmosphere, and then glucose is made. And the glucose is either going to be used by the plant or stored by the plant for later use. And it is that glucose that gets stored that heterotrophs will then eat. So let's write out what that formula is for photosynthesis, which is something that you should know at this point. So when we talk about photosynthesis, we are going to take carbon dioxide, which is coming from the air, and we're going to combine that with water. And then over our arrow, which means yield, that's going to be our sun energy. So energy from sun. And with that, we are going to make glucose, which is going to get stored as food, and oxygen, which is released as a gas. So once that energy from the sun is stored in glucose and other sorts of foods, we need to be able to then get that energy out at a later time. And so the process of cellular respiration is going to allow us to take the energy that was stored in the bonds of glucose and convert it into a more usable form of energy called ATP. And again, we'll get into more of the details of this process at a later time in the year. But for right now, what you should concentrate on is that you're going to take your sugar, which is glucose, and when the chemical reaction happens in the presence of oxygen, we produce carbon dioxide and water as waste products, and we form a whole bunch of energy. And we can form about 38 ATP from a single glucose molecule when we have oxygen available. And that is a super important process that all organisms go through, both heterotrophs and autotrophs. So as you can see from this diagram, the photosynthesis and cellular respiration occur in a cycle. So it starts with our energy from the sun. And through the process of photosynthesis, we're going to take that sun energy and transform it into chemical energy in the form of glucose. So in the bonds of a glucose molecule, there is energy within those bonds. And we also end up producing oxygen as a waste product. That glucose and oxygen will then enter into cellular respiration, which happen in mitochondria of the cell. And here we will take that energy that's in the bonds of the glucose and basically rearrange it and put it into a molecule called ATP, which is a much more usable form of energy, as I said before. And at the end of cellular respiration, we have carbon dioxide and water forming. And that carbon dioxide and water can then be used by photosynthesis to convert the energy from the sun and to make glucose. So it's very much a cycle. And again, later in the year, we will go into a lot more detail about what else goes on within this cycle and other ways that carbon and oxygen are cycled throughout our biosphere. So before we get into how energy actually flows through an ecosystem, I want to talk about something called a niche. A niche is where an organism lives within its ecosystem and how that organism uses its environment to survive. So this is a very simplified graphic of the angry birds. So you could think about it in terms of the yellow bird lives at the top part of the tree, the red bird can inhabit the middle part, and the blue bird inhabits the lower parts. And by inhabit, we're saying that they would use that part for food, for shelter, for reproduction. What is really important when we think about ecosystems and niches is that two organisms cannot occupy the exact same niche at the exact same time. And that's called the competitive exclusion theory. And basically, the red bird could not live where the yellow bird is living at the same time the yellow bird is there, because they would be competing completely for everything, and only one of them would be able to survive that. So it's really important to think about the niche of organisms when we talk about ecosystems. All right, so here we're going to look at how energy flows in ecosystems, and we're going to look at a food chain versus a food web. So basically, the only difference between the two is that in a food chain, it's showing one possible set of feeding relationships, and in a food web, you're going to look at multiple different feeding relationships that might exist within an ecosystem. So we always start with our producer. So we're going to kind of take a closer look at the food chain for right now, just because it's easier to see the different trophic levels. So trophic level is a feeding level that is found within an ecosystem. And so all food webs and food chains always start with a producer who is getting their energy from the sun. When the grasshopper eats the grass, energy is going to get transferred from the producer to the grasshopper. So the arrow points at the grasshopper, and we call the grasshopper the primary consumer because they're the first ones to eat. As the frog eats the grasshopper, we call that the secondary consumer. Snakes are the third to eat, so we refer to them as the tertiary consumer. And then in this food chain, we have a hawk, which we call a final consumer. Final consumers are sometimes called quaternary consumers. Most food chains and food webs don't go beyond tertiary or quaternary consumers, and we'll get into the reason for that later. And then it's important to note that we do have a set of decomposers that are going to come into play. They do gain some energy through this, but they play a much more important role in other ways. So if we transfer over to look at our full web, we can see that instead of only showing one possible set of feeding relationships, we're seeing multiple feeding relationships.
Whereas if we look at a web, we
so
can
we still
see
have
that
our
there
producer
is actually a lot more complex types of interactions.
and then we have our primary consumer, which is the grasshopper. So usually there's
the
more
producers
than
are
one
still doing their photosynthesis, and then we have our primary consumer, the grasshopper.
But from here we can see that we
instead
now
of just
have the
having
spider is a
one
secondary
thing
consumer because it eats
the grasshopper. Like
the
here we've got a spider that will eat the grasshopper.
So it can be
as a secondary consumer, you also have
the weasel eats the grasshopper, right?
So there's multiple different types of interactions.
So a lot of things are eating the grasshopper. So it's not just frogs.
So in class, we'll take a look at how all of those different interactions are really important to each other.
And we can see that the hawk has 4 arrows pointing
wiping out even one organism within a food web can have dire effects on all the other organisms.
So it's a much more complex set of interactions that can occur when we look at a food web.
So ecologists will use ecological pyramids to graphically show what kinds of organisms are found within an ecosystem and the numbers or biomass of them. So a biomass pyramid shows you the total amount of organic matter that might be within that ecosystem. And it really depends on the type of ecosystem that you're looking at. So a typical terrestrial ecosystem, which is one that's on land, you oftentimes will have a larger biomass of autotrophs than you would from, say, your higher order consumers at the top. Whereas in an aquatic ecosystem, it might be reversed. You might have less biomass in autotrophs and a much larger biomass in your carnivores, because those could be really large animals like various sharks and whales and things like that, where your autotrophs are really small little phytoplankton. And so they don't have a huge amount of mass to them. Whereas when we look at a pyramid of numbers, that might look a little bit different depending on what we're talking about. And this is based off the population size at each trophic level within that ecosystem. So the amount of actual organisms that are there. So if we wanted to take a look at this one here, where we have an oak tree as our quote unquote ecosystem, we have an oak tree. And within that oak tree, we might have 2,000 insects. and then 90 sparrows might use that oak tree for feeding and whatnot. And then there's one hawk that will feed on those sparrows within that oak tree ecosystem. So you can see how it doesn't look like your typical pyramid. Oftentimes when we're talking about biomass or pyramids of numbers, they can look a little bit different. So now we're going to take a look at an energy pyramid, which does look like a typical pyramid shape, and that's because of something called the 10% rule. So when we think about energy flow through an ecosystem, we know that our producers are getting their energy directly from the sun, so they've got 100% of available energy. As the energy moves up each trophic level, so as the primary consumers are eating the producers, only 10% of the energy is actually going to get stored in the next level. A lot of that other 90%, some of it's going to get lost as heat. Actually, a lot of it gets lost as heat. Some gets used for biological processes, which will then result in the loss of heat. But only about 10% is going to actually get stored in those primary consumers. And that's going to happen each step along the way. So as we move up to our secondary consumers, they're really only going to be storing 1% of that original 100%. And then when we get to our tertiary consumers, they are storing 0.1%. So as you go beyond tertiary consumer, there's very little energy being stored, which is why tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers, or our final consumers, are typically not eaten, because there's not a whole lot of energy that is available stored within them for the next organism to consume. So next we're going to take a look at biomagnification. And this basically is the opposite of energy transfer, where when you have a toxin or a chemical that is found within an ecosystem, as it moves through the trophic levels, it's going to increase in the amount that it is stored within the tissues of those organisms. So if algae pulled in a little bit of mercury from the water, the insects that ate the algae are eating a lot of the algae, so they are taking in more mercury and storing that mercury in their tissues. And every step along the way, each of the organisms is eating quite a bit of the one below it. So they're taking in more of that toxin. So that's what biomagnification is talking about. So we've noticed that energy will move basically in one direction through an ecosystem. So when we talk about energy flow, we start with energy in the sun. The energy moves over here to our producers. The producers then give that energy to the consumers when they get eaten, and the consumers will use it. The decomposers will gain some energy once they have decomposed organisms that have died, and that can be both from consumers or producers. But what decomposers do that is really important is that they take all of the organic matter that were in the producers and consumers and recycle them back into our organic nutrient pool. So we can take all of these different kinds of organic and inorganic materials that are found in our producers and consumers, and they get recycled back in, and then the producers can use them for growth, and then they get put back in the cycle. So energy flows in one direction. It doesn't ever go back to the sun. But if we think about different types of matter will get recycled over and over again by decomposers within an ecosystem. All right, so now I'm going to talk about something called ecosystem stability. And ecosystem stability relies largely on the concept of biodiversity. The larger the variety of different organisms within an ecosystem, the more likely that ecosystem will remain stable. Because you can have things happen within an ecosystem when there's a lot of biodiversity and still have organisms survive. So if we look at this food web over here, and let's say something happened and the lavender flowers were not blooming one year, the butterflies can still get their nectar from the flowering plants here. So it's not going to have a huge effect on the rest of the ecosystem necessarily. Whereas if there was only flowering plants and those went away, now the butterflies don't have anything to eat. And that can now have a trickle down effect to all of the other organisms within an ecosystem. So the more biodiversity we have, the healthier we say that ecosystem is. And that's what we strive for within an ecosystem. Now, within any ecosystem, you oftentimes are going to have something called a keystone species. And this is the species that the entire ecosystem depends upon, because that species is going to help keep all of the other populations in check. Sometimes it's the apex predator. So in this case, we're looking at the shark. The shark is the apex predator that eats the rays, and the rays eat the other smaller organisms down here, the arthropods and shellfish and hydra, whatever else is down there. So if the sharks went away, then the population of rays would increase substantially, and then that would cause a decrease in the biodiversity down here. And you can see most of our organisms have gone away because now there's so many rays because that shark is gone. But that keystone species really can fall anywhere within there, but it is within the ecosystem, but it is oftentimes that top predator within the ecosystem that kind of holds everything together. All right, and the final thing that we're going to note, and you will hear about this more later on in the unit, but is something called invasive species. Invasive species can have a huge effect on ecosystem stability. And an invasive species is a non-native species that will show up within an ecosystem, oftentimes because of human influence, and they can pretty much decimate an ecosystem. So this example here shows squirrel and coyote populations over time. So our red squirrels are our native squirrels, okay? And you can see their population started out at, a certain number here. And the predator to those red squirrels are coyotes. So here's their number. So as the red squirrel population goes up, the coyote population follows. So at around year 7, gray squirrels were introduced into this ecosystem, and they are invasive. And the problem here is that the gray squirrels were taking resources from the red squirrels, and the coyotes will not eat the gray squirrels. So what happens is the gray squirrel population increases exponentially, and this causes the red squirrel and the coyote populations to be decimated, and they die out. So just from the introduction of a gray squirrel caused basically 2 different species to die out. And that can have a huge effect on other species within that ecosystem as well.